Every single day, 4.7 million people board a plane. They check their bags, find their seats, buckle their seatbelts, and trust that the machine around them will keep them alive for the next several hours. Most of them never think twice about it. But here is the thing. Almost everything those passengers believe about flying is wrong. Not slightly off. Not a minor misunderstanding. Completely, fundamentally wrong. And some of those misconceptions, in the wrong situation, could cost you your life. The door right next to you is not locked. It never was. No key, no passcode, no sensor, just a lever, and anyone on that plane can pull it. So what is actually stopping someone from opening it at 35,000 feet? The answer is not what you think. And it is just the beginning of what you are about to learn. In the next 20 minutes, we are going to break down everything the airline industry never tells its passengers. The real physics keeping you alive up there. The myths repeated for decades. The secrets pilots know and passengers never ask about. And the facts that will completely change how you think about air travel forever. Every year, more than 4 billion passengers fly on commercial aircraft. That is more than half the population of Earth, moving through the sky in pressurized metal tubes, trusting a system most of them do not understand at all. Flying is, statistically, the safest form of transportation ever invented. You are more likely to die driving to the airport than on the flight itself. But safe does not mean simple. And the gap between what passengers think is happening and what is actually happening at 35,000 feet is enormous. So let us start with the thing that surprises people the most. The door. Every commercial aircraft has multiple doors. Passenger doors, service doors, emergency exits, and almost none of them have locks in the way you would expect. No keys, no electronic access codes, no deadbolts. If a passenger walks up to the main cabin door mid-flight and pulls the lever, nothing is stopping them from trying. This sounds terrifying, but here is why it almost never matters. Commercial aircraft fly at cruising altitudes of around 35,000 feet. At that height, the air outside is completely unbreathable. The pressure is less than a quarter of what it is at sea level. If you were teleported to that altitude right now, you would lose consciousness in under 3 minutes. To keep passengers alive, the entire cabin is pressurized. Air is continuously pumped in from the jet engines and maintained at a breathable level. And that pressure difference between the inside of the cabin and the outside atmosphere is what makes the door essentially impossible to open in flight. The main passenger door on a Boeing 737 has a surface area of roughly 1.5 square meters. At cruising altitude, the pressure difference pushes against that door with a force equivalent to lifting 9,000 kilograms. That is the weight of 6 full-size cars pressing against the door from the inside every single second the plane is in the air. No human being alive is strong enough to pull against that. The doors are also shaped like a plug, wider on the inside than the outside. The more pressure builds inside the cabin, the more tightly the door seats into its frame. To open the Boeing 737 door, you first have to pop it inward slightly before rotating it outward. That initial inward movement requires the force of lifting 9,000 kilograms, physically impossible at altitude. So why did a passenger manage to open an emergency exit on a commercial flight in South Korea in May 2023? Because the plane was on final approach, only a few hundred feet above the ground. At that altitude, the pressure difference between inside and outside had nearly equalized. A passenger in one of the exit rows grabbed the emergency exit lever and pulled with everything he had. 12 people were injured as wind tore through the cabin at nearly 200 kilometers per hour. But everyone survived because the plane was already seconds from touchdown. At cruising altitude, that door would not have moved a millimeter. The system protecting you is not a lock or a rule. It is the fundamental physics of pressure, and that physics, for the vast majority of every flight, is completely on your side. Now let us talk about why the plane is up there at 35,000 feet in the first place. Most passengers would say something about safety, avoiding storms, staying above the weather, and they would not be entirely wrong. But that is not the main reason. Not even close. The main reason planes fly so high is money. As altitude increases, the density of the air decreases. At 33,000 feet, the air density is roughly 1/3 of what it is at sea level. Less air resistance means the plane can fly approximately 73% faster for the same engine thrust. Faster flight means reaching the destination sooner. Reaching the destination sooner means burning less fuel. Fuel is the single largest operating cost for any airline, representing 25 to 30% of total expenses. Every foot of altitude is a financial calculation, but there are two more advantages. The jet stream, a band of fast-moving air circling the globe between 30,000 and 40,000 feet, flows west to east at speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. When pilots position a flight inside it, the aircraft gets a free push, dramatically cutting fuel consumption. That is why a flight from New York to London takes around 7 hours, but the return flight against the jet stream takes 9 hours. And jet engines themselves are more efficient at altitude. The combustion process runs better when intake air is cold. At cruising altitude, outside air is around -50 degrees Celsius compared to +15 degrees Celsius at sea level. Colder air means more efficient combustion, more thrust per unit of fuel burned. 3 compounding advantages, all working together, all measured in dollars and cents. The plane flies high because thin, cold air is enormously profitable. The oxygen masks above your seat look reassuring. They drop down in emergencies. They appear in every safety demonstration, and almost every passenger assumes that if those masks drop, they are safe. Here is what the safety demonstration does not tell you. Those masks contain approximately 12 to 15 minutes of oxygen, not hours, not an indefinite supply, 15 minutes, and they do not contain compressed oxygen from a tank. They generate oxygen through a chemical reaction. When you pull the cord, it triggers a sodium chlorate canister that burns at high temperature to produce oxygen. That reaction runs for 12 to 15 minutes, and then it is done. The reason for the 15-minute limit is engineering logic. In a sudden cabin depressurization, the pilot begins an emergency descent immediately, dropping from 35,000 feet to a breathable altitude of around 10,000 feet. That descent typically takes 10 to 15 minutes. The masks are designed to keep passengers conscious for exactly long enough for the pilots to bring the plane down to breathable air. If the pilots do their job, 15 minutes is enough. But here is the critical detail. The masks only work if you put them on correctly. The oxygen flows at a specific rate. If the mask does not seal properly against your face, the oxygen disperses into the surrounding air instead of entering your lungs. You receive almost no benefit from the mask at all. In April 2018, Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 suffered a catastrophic engine failure at 32,500 feet. Shrapnel shattered a window. The cabin depressurized instantly. The masks dropped. When photographs from inside the cabin began circulating afterward, aviation safety experts noticed something alarming. Most passengers had the masks over their mouths only, not their noses. The mask was on their face, but not sealed. In a genuine extended emergency at high altitude, those passengers would have been receiving almost no supplemental oxygen, despite believing they were protected. 15 minutes, nose and mouth, pull the strap tight. That is the entire difference between the mask working and the mask doing nothing. Let us talk about the pilots. Specifically, let us talk about how much of your flight they are actually flying. On a typical commercial flight, pilots manually control the aircraft during takeoff, the initial climb, the approach, and the landing. The rest of the flight, often the vast majority of total flight time, is handled by the autopilot. Autopilot is a remarkable system. It maintains precise heading and altitude, manages speed and power settings, and guides the aircraft along its route with far greater precision than any human pilot can sustain over hours of flying. It does not get tired. It does not get distracted. But autopilot does not think. It executes instructions. When the information feeding into the system becomes contradictory or unreliable, it disconnects, and it hands control back to the humans. On June 1st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 was crossing the Atlantic from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Ice crystals blocked the pitot tubes, the sensors that measure airspeed. With conflicting data, the autopilot did exactly what it was designed to do. It disconnected and handed control to the pilots. What happened next is one of the most studied sequences of events in modern aviation. The co-pilots, faced with sudden manual control at night over the ocean with unreliable instruments, made a series of errors. The aircraft stalled. Recovering from a stall requires pushing the nose down to increase airspeed. But when you feel the aircraft dropping, every instinct tells you to pull up. One of the co-pilots kept pulling back throughout the descent. The plane fell for 3 minutes and 28 seconds from 35,000 feet to the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. All 228 people on board died. The investigation revealed something deeply uncomfortable. These were trained, experienced pilots. They were not negligent. They were overwhelmed by a sudden transition from automation to manual control in an extreme environment. Aviation experts called it automation dependency. Pilots who spend the majority of their hours monitoring an autopilot gradually lose some of the instinctive flying skills that manual control requires. The phrase that emerged was "children of the magenta," a reference to the autopilot's guidance line on the flight display that pilots follow so consistently they can forget how to fly without it. Modern training now requires regular manual flying practice to counter this effect. But the broader truth remains. The autopilot is flying your plane for most of your flight. The system that keeps everyone safe is not just the technology, it is the humans who know when to trust it and when not to. Every year, commercial aircraft worldwide are struck by lightning roughly 25,000 times. Approximately once every 20 minutes, somewhere in the world, a plane gets hit. And almost nobody on any of those flights notices. The fuselage of a commercial aircraft acts as a Faraday cage, a conductive enclosure that distributes electrical charge around its exterior without allowing it to penetrate the interior. The current travels through the metal skin and exits through a wingtip or the tail without passing through the cabin or affecting critical systems. Every wire and electronic component is shielded and grounded specifically to survive lightning strikes. Lightning has not caused a commercial aviation accident in the United States since 1963. But knowing that lightning cannot bring down a modern aircraft does not make it less terrifying when it happens to you. In 2018, passengers on a Delta flight descending into Atlanta described the experience in vivid detail. At 12,000 feet, a massive bang and a white flash filled the cabin. Several passengers screamed. The cockpit went silent. One passenger texted his children goodbye. Another said the pilot was visibly shaken when he later spoke to the cabin. The plane landed safely with minor external damage to the aircraft skin and was back in service within hours. The passengers experienced something that felt like the end. The aircraft experienced a routine electrical event its designers had anticipated 60 years ago. The plane knows what lightning is. You are not in danger. But nobody tells you that before the bang. The air you are breathing on a commercial flight came from the jet engines, not from outside the aircraft directly. From the compressor stage of the engines, where air is drawn in and compressed before combustion. A portion of that compressed air is bled off before fuel is added, cooled, filtered, and pumped into the cabin. This bleed air system is how most commercial aircraft are pressurized and ventilated. In normal operation, this works exactly as designed. The cabin air is replaced roughly every 2 to 3 minutes, which is actually better than most office buildings. The problem is what happens when it does not work as intended. Jet engines use oil to lubricate their internal components. On some flights, small amounts of engine oil contaminate the bleed air supply. The oil compounds include organophosphates, which are neurotoxic at sufficient concentrations. When contaminated bleed air reaches the cabin, the event is called an aerotoxic fume event. Passengers and crew report a distinctive smell, described variously as dirty socks or a mechanic's garage. Some feel nothing. Others report headaches, dizziness, blurred vision, and disorientation. For most passengers, symptoms resolve after landing. But for flight crew who experience repeated fume events over years of daily flying, the cumulative exposure has been linked to chronic neurological effects in a pattern researchers call aerotoxic syndrome. The aviation industry disputes the severity of the risk, but pilot and flight attendant unions in multiple countries have pushed for independent research and mandatory reporting of fume events. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was specifically designed without a bleed air system. It uses electrically driven compressors to supply cabin air, completely bypassing any risk of engine oil contamination. Almost no passenger knows this distinction exists. But if you are flying on a 787, you are breathing air that has never passed through a jet engine. On almost every other commercial aircraft, it has. When a plane descends toward landing at night, the cabin lights dim. Most passengers assume this is for comfort, a signal to settle down and prepare to arrive. It is not. It is a survival protocol. If the aircraft has to be evacuated on the runway after landing, the evacuation happens in whatever light conditions exist outside. At night, those conditions can be very dark. The human eye transitioning from a brightly lit environment to darkness takes between 10 to 30 minutes to fully adapt. During those first minutes, vision is severely compromised. By dimming the cabin lights during descent, the crew gives passengers partial dark adaptation before any emergency occurs. If the lights go out entirely during an evacuation, passengers who have been sitting in bright light are essentially blind for the first critical minutes. Passengers whose eyes have had 20 minutes of gradual adjustment can see well enough to find the exits and get out. The exit signs stay lit for this reason. The floor-level lighting strips leading to the exits are there for this reason, and the dimming of overhead lights during descent is there for this reason. The crew is not creating atmosphere. They are doing the math on how many seconds it takes for your eyes to adjust to darkness and deciding that 20 minutes of gradual dimming is worth it for the lives it might save. Let us talk about the fuel. A fully loaded Boeing 777 on a long-haul flight can carry up to 145,000 liters of jet fuel. Fuel is the heaviest thing on the aircraft, and more weight means more fuel burned to carry it. Fuel costs represent 25 to 30% of an airline's total operating expenses. Every kilogram beyond the regulatory minimum is a kilogram that reduces efficiency and increases cost. Regulatory minimums require enough fuel to reach the destination, enough to divert to an alternate airport, plus a standard reserve of around 30 minutes additional flying time. Beyond that, pilots have discretion to request extra fuel for weather, anticipated delays, or forecast winds that may not materialize. In practice, pilots have reported in aviation forums and safety testimony that there is a cultural pressure in many airlines against requesting extra fuel. Not explicit orders, more subtle. A dispatcher who questions the fuel request. A fuel order that comes in slightly below what the pilot asked for. A pattern where pilots who fly lean are not questioned, and pilots who request more are. In 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 ran out of fuel completely at 41,000 feet. A unit conversion error during fueling meant the aircraft departed with roughly half the fuel it needed. Ground crew calculated in pounds. The aircraft required kilograms. At 41,000 feet, both engines flamed out. The Boeing 767 became a 132-ton glider. The captain, Bob Pearson, had extensive glider experience before flying commercial aircraft. He guided the powerless plane to a former Royal Canadian Air Force base at Gimli, Manitoba, which had been converted to a racing circuit. The runway was partially blocked by barriers and spectators. Pearson landed the aircraft with no engine power, no hydraulics, and only backup instruments functioning. There were minor injuries among the 69 people on board. Nobody died. The Gimli Glider is one of the most remarkable pieces of airmanship in aviation history. It is also a story about a unit conversion error and a system that did not catch it before the aircraft left the ground. Every commercial aircraft now carries redundant fuel measurement systems. But the margin between enough and not enough at 41,000 feet over remote terrain is not always as wide as passengers imagine. Here is what all of this adds up to. Flying is the safest form of mass transportation in human history. The engineering standards, training requirements, redundancy systems, and safety culture that emerged from every accident and every near miss have produced something extraordinary. A system that moves billions of people through the air every year and loses almost none of them. But that safety does not come from ignorance. It comes from people choosing to understand the system they are part of. The door is not locked because physics does the job better than any lock. The plane flies high because thin, cold air is profitable. The oxygen mask gives you 15 minutes, which is enough if you seal it correctly over both your nose and your mouth. The autopilot is extraordinary and limited in equal measure. Lightning is terrifying and harmless. The bleed air system works almost always, and the 787 solved the problem for those who know to look for it. The lights dim at landing because someone thought carefully about your eyes in the dark. And the fuel in the tanks represents one of the most precise calculations made before every flight. None of this should make you afraid to fly. It should make you less afraid, because fear lives in the space where understanding is missing. And now you understand a little more of what is actually keeping you alive up there. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you think about flying, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden science behind the things we take for granted every single day. And share this with someone who is afraid to fly, because the truth, it turns out, is far more reassuring than the mystery.